I'm Rachel Lloyd. I'm the Assistant Director of Regulation with responsibility for registration, advice and adjudication, so the second part of the fitness to practice process. Thank you for your time today. I'm going to start by giving you some context in relation to fitness to practice, and then I'm going to talk through my main stages of the process. Social Work England's role is set out in law, in the Act that governs us. And we have three primary purposes: public protection, promoting confidence in social workers, and promoting professional standards. To be a social worker in England, the person must be registered with us and be fit to practice. Fitness to practice isn't just about professional performance, it's also about a social worker's conduct outside the workplace. And by fit to practice, we mean that a person can practice safely and effectively because they have the relevant skills and knowledge, character and health. And when we make a decision about someone's fitness to practice, we consider their current and future situation. Our process isn't about assigning blame or punishment for past mistakes. It's about current impairment. We set professional standards, which were co-produced with the sector and others back in 2019. The standards are threshold standards necessary for safe and effective practice, and social workers must continue to meet professional standards to maintain their registration. This is done by self-declaration during the annual renewal process, and the standards set out the requirements that we expect social workers to meet to be fit to practice. Each standard includes descriptors. For example, standard 2 on maintaining trust and confidence includes descriptors such as being open, honest, reliable and fair, treating people with sensitivity and handling confidential information in line with the law. And when we consider fitness to practice concerns, we consider whether there's been a breach of the professional standards. I'll spend a little bit of time talking through the different stages of the fitness to practice process. As you can see from this slide, there are 5 key stages: triage, investigations, case examinations, hearings, and case review. Many of our referrals close at the triage stage, and only the most serious cases make their way through to a substantive hearing. So, starting at the beginning, when we receive concerns, which may be a self-referral from a social worker or from a member of public or from an employer, they go to our triage team. And the team considers whether there are reasonable grounds for investigating, whether the social worker's fitness to practice is likely to be impaired. And in order to make that assessment, the triage team undertake a triage test that covers whether there's reasonable grounds to investigate the concerns, whether the concern suggests current impairment, and I'll talk a little bit about impairment shortly. And there are 2 possible outcomes at triage. If the concern doesn't meet the triage test, which is set out in our regulatory rules, we close the concern. If the concern does meet the triage test, it gets forward on to our investigations team. At the investigation stage, we have an investigator who's supported by a lead investigator. And at that point, we advise the social worker of the concerns they're going to investigate. They'll offer the social worker the opportunity to provide a written response and any other information they wish to provide, and they'll request further information at that point. During the investigation, the investigators will gather additional information from the social worker and other relevant people and organisations. And once they've concluded their investigation, they complete what we call a case investigation report, and they prepare a bundle of all the documents containing all of the relevant evidence. This is normally provided to the social workers at that stage with the report to allow for further responses to the concerns. Case investigation report and bundle of evidence is passed on to our case examiners, which is the next decision-making point. Case examiners work in pairs. One professional case examiner, who is a registered and practicing social worker, and one lay case examiner, so that's someone with no background in social work. The case examiners work together to scrutinise the evidence and decide whether there's a realistic prospect that the adjudicators at a hearing would determine that fitness to practice is impaired. And they review everything on papers alone. If there is no realistic prospect, then the case examiners can close the concern, and they've got three possible outcomes if they close the concern. They can close the concern with no further action, or they can choose to give advice or warning for a particular period of time. But if they have determined there's a realistic prospect, then case examiners can either refer the case directly for a hearing, or they can propose a closure or disposal where they decide a hearing is not appropriate and not in the public interest. The case examiners can propose any of the following outcomes to the social worker: advice, warning, restrictions on practice, which might either be conditions that restrict practice in certain ways, or a suspension from practice for a period of time, or removal from the register. If a social worker does not agree with that decision or accepted disposal, the case will have to be referred to a hearing. Our hearings are usually held in public, and our advocate sets out the evidence relating to the allegations about the social worker's fitness to practice. And the social worker or their representative have the opportunity to respond to those allegations, to question witnesses that are called by Social Work England, to call witnesses of their own, and to make their own submissions on facts, impairment and sanction. And again, at the hearing, the adjudicators will make a final decision about the case. And there are two possible outcomes. Again, either impairment or no impairment. And the sanctions, if impairment is found, are exactly the same as those outcomes at case examination stage: advice, warnings, conditions, suspension or removal. Our hearings team are neutral within the process, and they're there to service the hearing and ensure that due process is followed. Our advocates are instructed by investigations, and the decisions are made by a panel of adjudicators who work independently. And there's always at least one social worker on the panel. They're also supported by legal advisors to ensure that the appropriate case law is considered. And it's important to note that our decision makers at both case examinations and hearings must select the least restrictive sanction to protect the public and the wider public interest. And finally, we have the case review stage. We refer some cases to the case review team, where the final order is either a suspension or conditions of practice. And the role of the case review team is to ensure that the social worker understands the restrictions on their practice, to understand what information might be reviewed by a panel and what's useful to bring to a future panel, and what information they might wish to bring to show further learning, insight and remediation. So just before I hand over, I just wanted to talk briefly about impairment. Fitness to practice can be impaired under one or more of the 8 types of impairment, as you can see on the slide. Examples of fitness to practice concerns could include dishonesty, fraud, abuse of trust or position, and that could include not maintaining professional boundaries with a person of lived experience or social work. It could also include serious breaches of a person's confidentiality or data protection requirements, serious or repeated failings in a person's care. So, for example, failing to conduct statutory visits, or where a social worker's performance in their role has harmed people. Just a little bit just wanted to share some of our latest data with you. We have the number of concerns that we receive each year, a spread of how they come from employers, members of the public, and others. 80% of those concerns are closed at triage stage and do not progress into investigation. And this is to reinforce that it is only the most serious cases that will progress through to an investigation. And just before I finish, I thought I'd just share a flavour of the 5 top concerns that come from both members of the public and from employers, just to give you a little bit of an inkling, insight into the sort of different concerns that we receive. If you've had a chance to review those, I'll hand over to my colleagues, Paul and Suzanne. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel, and good morning, everybody. We'll introduce ourselves first before we progress with this presentation. I'm Paul Hollingdale, and I'm one of the professional advisors employed by Social Work England, so I'm a registered social worker.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Brennan. I'm also a professional advisor here at Social Work England and a registered social worker.
Thanks, Suzanne. In previous years, when we presented something similar, can we just go back a slide? Sorry, Suzanne. When we presented something similar to this presentation, we've looked at concerns in the way that Rachel's described, right from triage all the way through to a sanction at case examine or hearing stage. But for the purpose of today, we wanted to focus only and purely on our triage stage of decision making. And within that, consider 2 types of concerns we receive where social workers are exercising their professional judgment in practice or their professional responsibility in practice. And it's at this stage we'd like to invite you very briefly as audience members, if you wish to do so, to just comment in our chat function about what those words mean to you. What does professional judgment mean to you in day-to-day practice? What does professional responsibility mean to you in your day-to-day practice?
We'll just wait a few seconds.
Thanks, Suzanne.
We've got keeping people safe, accountability, upholding ethical values and beliefs, showing our working out, supporting others, honesty, advocating, fair treatment of others, legal literacy, accountability, informed decision making, following the law. Some really great answers.
Yeah, brilliant.
Doing right by service users and advocating appropriately, and transparency, sorry, can't get my words out. Thank you, everyone. Some really great answers there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll come back to very briefly to some of those observations. All of those observations are really good. Some of those, I smile because it's important that we hold on to those, and we'll just touch on them later about our working out and legal literacy. So can we just look at the next slide, please, Suzanne? Thank you. Certainly as a regulator, I think it's important to stress, and you would want to hear from us, that we recognise that as social workers, and we are social workers ourselves, that we have to bear in mind when we receive concerns, whoever sends us those concerns, we have to consider the seriousness of the concern that's being raised with us. And we also recognise that as social workers, you have to, on a day-to-day basis, make difficult decisions that will have far-reaching consequences for those people that you're working with, service users, families, others, and perhaps other organisations. We also recognise that a concern about an impact of a reasonable decision that you make that is being properly arrived at will not or does not in itself amount to a concern that's serious otherwise, because we don't have that crystal ball to talk about what might be the implications of that decision. But if it's one that you've reasonably made and properly arrived at. those are some of the factors and context that we would give consideration to when looking at that concern within the triage stage. Now, Suzanne and I'm stating the obvious here, of course, Social Work England, we receive concerns about practice that involve professional judgment, professional responsibility, post-interaction or intervention from a social worker. And we are mindful as professional advisors, registered social workers, about the concept of defensible decision-making. And some of you have already talked about your working out and being legally literate. And we would echo and support that. So in context, when a concern is received by us that might call into question professional judgment, professional responsibility, has that decision been one that you and I as social workers evidences in terms of our rationale for that decision we've made? Who else have we consulted when coming to that decision or coming to that recommendation? For example, our line manager. Have we followed appropriate policy, be that local policy or national policy? And certainly legal responsibilities. A few people have commented, I think there, Suzanne, about the importance of being legally literate in practice. And one of those other factors is how we recorded, how we've arrived at that decision and how we've evidenced that decision in our record keeping. So those are some of the factors and context in which we would take into account concerns raised with us. Suzanne, I think you're just going to talk briefly about some of the typical types of concerns we receive.
Yes, thanks, Paul. We thought it might be useful to share some common types of concerns that we receive. I won't go through all of these, but I think that we'd probably be able to identify those where a social worker's professional judgment and responsibility can be a contributing factor. For example, if we consider breach of professional boundaries, and in these circumstances, thinking about what Paul has just discussed on the previous slide. So is this act one that might be evidence-based? Did the social worker use all of the information available at the time? Was anyone consulted, such as their manager? And maybe was it recorded in a way that evidences these things or explains a particular situation? And I think we can ask these types of questions of a significant number of the concerns that we receive, and that helps those people in triage to understand the context of those concerns. And again, we thought it might be helpful to look at our triage process. The triage process considers whether there are reasonable grounds for investigating whether the social worker's fitness to practice is impaired. And there are 3 stages within triage. That begins with the con stage. This involves the basic checks, identifying the social worker, making sure there's no duplicates. It does also consider if the concern is so serious that an interim order would be needed, and therefore we would need to act quickly. We have the pre-triage, which is more around evidence gathering. The concern is allocated to a triage officer, a risk assessment's undertaken, and requests for further information or evidence are made, along with assessing if the concerns meet the statutory grounds of impairment, and that considering that even if the concern is found, is it so serious that it engages fitness to practice, and is it a lower level, or is it a lower level and would not have the relevant evidence to support and can therefore be closed. And the final stage is the triage decision-making stage, where Rule 3 triage test is applied and a full decision is taken to either close the concern or progress for further investigation. And this slide gives us a reminder of the triage test that is applied to all concerns. So the seriousness of concerns and the likely availability of evidence. Seriousness in this sense relates to the risk of harm to the public or risk to public confidence in the profession. And evidence at this stage, we only need to obtain sufficient information to allow a triage decision to be made. We also consider any breaches of legislation, statutory guidance, our standards or employer guidance. There's consideration of the outcomes of any other investigation, so that could be by other employers or other regulators. Is there any remedial action? So thinking about engagement with an employer investigation and local resolution of practice issues or any other adverse findings. And as we've introduced the triage test, we now want to consider two concerns that relate to social workers exercising their professional judgment and or professional responsibility. I'm going to hand back to Paul now, and he's going to take us through these concerns.
Yes, thanks very much, Suzanne. Yeah, these are two of the more common types of concerns that we receive from employers of social workers. So those are the broad outline concerns we receive at a concern stage. Again, I'd just like to invite audience members, if you wish, without any further information or underpinning evidence supporting those types of concerns, would you feel on their own in isolation that these are something that Social Work England would be interested in, would want to look into further? And if so, would you think that's true of both of them or one only? Can we just open the chat very briefly again, please?
If you could maybe put in one, two, or both. We'll see what the general consensus is. The chat's moving so quickly, I can't get to the bottom. Lots of both, lots of people thinking that both concerns would be progressed. A couple of one, a couple saying two, but the general consensus is both, Paul.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Thanks very much for that, people, colleagues, for making those contributions. We're going to look at these concerns in a little bit more detail. So for the first of those concerns, accessing records without professional reason to do so. So as I said earlier, these are the types of concerns we do see on a fairly regular basis from employers. So in this particular case, as Rachel and Suzanne explained, at triage, we will reach out to those who raise a concern with us to seek further clarification, further information, further evidence. And in this particular case, we find that the employer who made raised this concern with us then tell us the following information: that having undertaken their own investigation, they discover that the social worker involved was motivated with an intent to support a colleague who did have professional oversight of that case, but that colleague at that time didn't have access to the local authorities' IT systems. They confirm that it was an isolated matter. The employer also confirms that there was no harm caused, and the employer finally confirms, and we heard this word said earlier, that the social worker concerned has reflected and undertaken remediation, and in this case has undertaken some local training on access to records and GDPR. So now, in light of this information, I'd invite audience members to say, do you feel that this is something that would progress to an investigation or could possibly be closed?
I think the general consensus is closed. Closed with advice, closed, context is important. Investigation as dishonesty has been demonstrated. Interesting.
Yeah.
Closed. Yeah, I think the majority closed, but there are some differences of opinion there.
Yes,
thank you.
Absolutely. And I saw a comment about employer ought to complete investigation. We'll have a conversation further on in this presentation about reflections and learning from these types of concerns. So thank you everybody for those contributions. So we have a second similar case where an employer has referred a social worker for accessing records without professional reason to do so. And in this situation, the employer, when we've reached out to them for further information, confirms the following in brief. That they say, as an employer, that they have conducted an investigation And in this situation, they confirmed to us at Social Work England that the social worker has accessed records, but in this scenario, they've accessed records about one of their own family members. And the motivation for doing so was that the social workers in dispute with another family member about the care and support arrangements of a relative. So on that basis, similar question, invite the audience, is this something that you feel at triage that would be closed or progress to an investigation? And with a slightly different question here, what would make the difference? What do you feel makes the difference? If you're thinking it's going to progress to an investigation, what do you see as the difference between this and the first concern?
Investigation, as there is motive. First answer, personal gain. People saying think a written warning and clause. There's a conflict of interest. Investigation because of boundaries. Progress, conflict of interest, professional boundaries. Investigation because they've undertaken that for their own benefit. Breach of GDPR. Progressed, it's not a professional matter. Is it a safeguarding issue? Misuse of resources. Yeah, thank you. Lots of suggestions there. I think
excellent.
The general thoughts for that one to progress, Paul.
Thank you. Sounds like there's a few people on the call who could be triage officers, I think. But more seriously, I think, yes, you've identified some of the key differences here, so thank you for that. So in the first case, there's evidence of there was no harm caused, there was a legitimate reason to access those records in support of a colleague who did have legitimate reason to have access to those records, and the employer confirmed matters of remediation and reflection and actions taken. Whereas in the second case, many of you picked up on some of those primary concerns. There was no professional reason to access those records. It was purely motivated from a private life perspective, and that would bring into question potentially public confidence in a social worker. And there is no evidence of defensible decision-making in play in this particular concern. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to that second concern, which is about failure to undertake statutory visits. So in the first concern, and again, these are, as I said earlier, these are the types of concerns we do see from employers. So we have the first concern of a social worker allegedly failing to undertake statutory visits. Our triage colleagues reached out to the employer who made the referral, and on that basis, we received the following information. So in terms of context, the employer confirmed that the social worker had a high caseload. They also confirmed that following their investigation, this related to two cases on that social worker's caseload, and both related to child in need visits. The employer did confirm that the visits did occur, but they fell outside of local policy guidelines in terms of timescales, and that the social worker remains employed by this employer. So again, on that brief contextual information, would you feel as audience members this is something that Social Work England would close or could close at triage, or would progress to an investigation?
If we can just open the chat.
Sorry, yes, could we open the chat?
Closed after triage. Closed pending internal investigation, i.e. workload. Refer back to the employer to support and manage. Close for the social worker, but continue to investigate management. Interesting. Not clear, probably closed, but depends on timing of visits. Due to high caseload, this could be looked at. If worked in children's, this could be every social worker. There's not enough information. Close. Yeah, general consensus is for this one to close.
No, that's really helpful. Those comments are really insightful as well. So thank you, everybody. So as before, we'll move on to a second concern of a similar nature, failing to undertake statutory visits, a referral by an employer. Apologies. So again, in this situation, our triage colleagues reached out to those, the employer who made the referral, and again, we received the following information in brief. So again, contextually, the employer told us that after their investigation that they confirmed this social worker again had a high caseload. But the failing to undertake statutory visits applied to 6 child protection visits for 6 separate families. And in addition, the social worker had recorded that those visits had taken place. So again, on that brief information, as audience members, do you feel that given that information, it's a scenario that could be closed at triage or would potentially progress to an investigation? And if you're progressing it to investigation, what do you feel is the difference between this concern and the previous concern?
Investigation, progress to investigation, dishonesty, the social workers lied. Again, keeping up with the coming in thick and fast. Dishonesty, investigation, it's child protection, investigation based on dishonesty, it's more risky. Investigation, dishonesty, and high risk. Yeah, very similar answers. Very similar answers. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, no, thank you, everybody. You've beaten me to it, because those what you've described there are the notes that I have written down in terms of some of the difference between the first concern and the second concern. So, for example, in the first concern, it's alleged about statutory visits, but we know child in need visits are consensual. So we have to be clear about what is meant by a statutory visit, legally meant by a statutory visit. Whereas in the second one, you're quite right. This relates to child protection visits to 6 separate children and their families. And it's certainly aggravated by, or appears to be aggravated from the employer's evidence, that this is a social worker who's actually recorded that those visits had taken place when it seems that they did not take place. So that brings in potential matters of dishonesty. Okay, so we are mindful, what can we learn from this? And if this is a brief session, and we're going to talk at the end of this about where else we can have conversations about learning from fitness to practice and share those insights. But we do recognise as registered social workers that, and very mindful that on a day-to-day basis, as we set out earlier, that you are making difficult decisions that have far-reaching consequences for people. But it is important that we, in our practice as individuals, because we have that responsibility as social workers, follow some of the suggestions we made earlier, and that ones that Suzanne's going to repeat now. But there's also learning here from employers, and we'll touch on that shortly. So Suzanne, do you want to just briefly touch on some of the learning we feel for individual practitioners? I think you might be on mute still, Suzanne.
Oh, that was bound to happen at some point, wasn't it? Do apologise. So yeah, I'll start again. This slide is taken from the Good Decision Making Practitioners Handbook by Geraldine Nazowska and Lucy Series, and in essence covers the factors that we've highlighted today, including our responsibility as social workers to consider legal frameworks, procedures, how decisions are brought, rationale and analysis, and that good record keeping is key to defensible decision making and accountability, to more than just the individual. As social workers, when making judgments, we have a professional responsibility to be conscious, mindful and transparent, and communicate factors such as those that are highlighted here. And linking back to the triage process, for example, and the pre-triage considerations, this is the type of evidence that would support triage officers in making their recommendations for potential closure or for further investigation.
Thanks, Suzanne. And again, we've got the chat open because we really welcome your reflections, either as individual social workers on some of the immediate learning in practice that you might have derived from this presentation. And if we have any employers in the room, senior managers or people from HR, any learning that you might take from this brief overview of scenarios of concerns we receive at triage. Some of our reflections that Suzanne and I have discussed are, and some of you have mentioned it yourself in the chat, I've noticed, some of these concerns, I think we agree, the majority agree that concerns one for accessing records and concern one for statutory visits may not have needed to be raised at all with Social Work England had, for example, the employer's investigation been completed and local action intervention taken place. And to help employers, managers consider whether a referral needs to be made to Social Work England, then I hope most of you will know, but some may not know, we have regional engagement leads. Renee herself, who introduced this session, is a regional engagement lead. So we have colleagues who are registered social workers working across areas of England who can be reached and spoken to. We also run fitness to practice workshops, and you can find information about that again through our regional engagement leads or through our website. We would encourage all employers to appoint somebody who's nominated as a single point of contact, and we have a network of support for single point of contact nominated officers. They're usually, experience tells me, and I stand to be corrected, principal social workers or equivalent. And as I said earlier, we do run, or our regional engagement leads run on a regular basis, fitness to practice workshops. But we would really welcome your observations, insights and learning and reflection about how we can continue to work together. Because of course, as a regulator, as you know, and we would want, our role and responsibility is about protecting the public and public confidence. But within that, as a regulator, we clearly want to be involved in those most serious concerns that bring into question mine, yours, Suzanne's fitness to practice as a social worker. Okay, have we got any immediate reflection? We haven't got time or opportunity to get involved in any meaningful conversation at this stage, I don't feel, Suzanne, but are there any thematic feedback?
Yeah, there's comments from Alado, feeling that they don't get things referred to them as often as they should, or their involvement. We've got a question about what book the slide's based on. I've got the information about that, so I can share that later.
You mentioned Alado. We haven't put it up there as a reflection, but we do have a Alado network as well. And again, that's perhaps information we will look at your feedback after this session. So thank you very much for that. We will take it into account, and if you have left a name and perhaps a contact detail, we can reach out and provide information.
Absolutely, and I think the key area to have some of those discussions and have questions answered is through the regional engagement leads, through those regular meetings, and through the single point of contact meetings that take place on a regular basis as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Rennie, am I right in thinking you've got some final observations, words?
Thanks, Paul, Suzanne, and Rachel. Just to close, as Paul has indicated, I'm part of the regional engagement lead team of regional engagement leads at Social Work England. So do get in touch if you need any further information in terms of the fitness to practice process, or where we have principal social workers or social work leads on the call that you have that relationship with your regional engagement lead in terms of clarifying any process issues or any other sort of engagement activity within your different regions. I think it just leaves me to thank you for such an interesting presentation. Of course, the recording will be available shortly after Social Work Week on our YouTube channel. And we really hope that you enjoyed today's session, and thank you for your contributions. And the chat was really active, and it's really good to see, social workers, giving their point of view on the different scenarios. We'd appreciate it if you can complete a brief survey, which we will add to the chat shortly. And we welcome any feedback that you have, either via the form that's going to be put into the chat or by emailing socialworkweek@socialworkengland.org.uk. And don't forget, if you're a social worker in England, this session can be used as CPD, and you could reflect on what you have learned with a colleague, your manager, or another professional, and that would meet the requirement to reflect with a peer. So thank you. Unless we have any other contributions, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you throughout the week as we have lots of interesting sessions today and for the rest of Social Work Week. Thank you, everyone.